theologians, God doesn't do much except through us. And so I feel called to be the hands and feet of the best in the universe to move us toward love and justice and acceptance. And we can do that. We have power to do that, but we have to talk to each other. We have to organize. And so even if you're not able to make it Thursday night, I'll carry back what we find and what we plan and keep you informed. Thanks for being kind-hearted, loving, and generous people who want to make the world better for all of us. Well, this time of year, Unitarian Universalists and lots of other people turn their attention to our big annual meetings. This is the time of year for our General Assembly, which is an annual gathering of delegates from congregations that come together to decide big things and to worship together and talk about what it means to be a UU in the world together. This year, our General Assembly is in Kansas City. I've spent a lot of time in Kansas City. I think the only, well, anyway, never mind. You might be from Kansas City. So. My mind was blown by a lot of things at my first Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly. The incredible spirit-filled worship with thousands of Unitarian Universalists from around the world, the vocal support of LGBTQ equality, and on a less serious but much more puzzling note, the mass thumbing of the nose at the conventions of modern fashion. I mean, you got to do you, but there have to be limits, I would think. Maybe not. Months before before the meeting began, I got the General Assembly booklet that you used to get. I think now it's an email. And I marked every session that I wanted to attend. The one I was most excited about was a talk that was going to be given by Greg Epstein, the Jewish humanist chaplain at Harvard. The truth was, I just had no concept of how Judaism and humanism could work together. Now, I was in my angry atheist phase at that time. It lasted a few months, I think. As such, I remember a couple of things about that session. I remember feeling affirmed in my belief, which of course I still hold, that human beings are capable of finding the truth without any help from a supernatural guide. I also remember cringing at some of the anti-theist comments made by some of the small crowd there to listen to Greg Epstein that day. Some of the UUs there seemed to think that people who believed in a God were the enemy. I didn't have anything against theists, I just didn't like the God I grew up with anymore. Humanism is so much more than just the rejection of a God or the supernatural. It is a living, evolving, dare I say, belief system that speaks to us in this historical moment. So to talk about modern-day humanism, I'm excited to invite forward someone whom I'm just thrilled to have join us this morning. Sarah Blaine is a humanist activist. She's a thought leader, and she's co-host of the podcast, The Human Experience. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I've listened to a few, and they're fantastic. I chatted with Sarah and her business partner, Evan Clark, this week about humanism, and she was kind enough to be here this morning. So, Sarah, welcome to Valley Unitarian Universalist Congregation.
Good morning.
So, I'm going to put you on the spot right away and ask you to start by giving us your definition of humanism.
Okay, well, I wrote it down because I
knew
this was coming. But I do want to preface this by saying, because humanism rests so heavily on ways of knowing like reason and experience as opposed to things like scripture and tradition, when we get new information about the world around us, about ourselves, we update our definition of humanism. So it's constantly changing. And so the definition I give you isn't going to be my definition next year. I also want to emphasize that there are multiple humanisms, just like there are multiple theologies. And so the humanism that is relevant for me today in Phoenix, Arizona, is not the humanism that a humanist leader in Ghana would be practicing. So without further ado, humanism means taking responsibility for the value of every life without reservation through reason, compassion, experience, and hope. That's my definition.
Nicely done. Thank you. So your journey to humanism, and especially your relationship to your father and your own work in the Christian church, is really fascinating to me. I've only heard a little piece of that story, but can you talk some about that journey and about what drew you to humanism, and maybe a little about the work you're doing now too at the end?
Yeah, sure. So my dad is a United Methodist minister, and my mom she went through many faith transitions throughout her life. At the end of her life, she was a Hasidic Jew, so there's a lot of interfaithing in my family. But we were all very progressive. We understood religious language very metaphorically. For me, it was sort of a poetry about values. And my understanding of Jesus was very humanistic. The things that I love about the Jesus stories aren't, the magic that he does, but that he makes a conscious effort to be present with people where they are, and to stand with the marginal and affirm them. And that's not miracle work, that's humanist work. So I loved my religious experience. I loved being involved in the United Methodist Church. But as time went on and the sort of social atmosphere around LGBTQ equality was more and more poignant for me, the Methodist Church was not moving forward. And there were certainly people within our congregation who were on the right side of that issue, but we had to constantly try and do sort of acrobatics with our theology to apologize for scripture that does seem to say negative things about people with gay identity. We had to try and update this language and change it to be relevant. And at the end of the day, I just wanted to be able to say, this is the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do. I don't want to have to, somehow reinvent Paul's theology to make that happen. And I think and the Methodist Church is still lagging behind on this. I think that they will get there, but they're late to the party, and there have been a lot of kids who have committed suicide from religious families. A lot of folks have been rejected, and just so much destruction because of that. And I couldn't be attached to that anymore. I didn't want to have to fight my own community to do the right thing, and I didn't want to destroy families. So essentially, when I adopted humanism, it was not a change in my beliefs, but it was a change in the language that I choose to use to describe my beliefs. So I don't use the religious poetry of God language anymore, but I think that many of my core values are still really the same. And my dad and I have a fantastic relationship. I've preached at his church a couple of times. We've done Bible studies together, and I think he also views our values as really similar, but the language is just different.
There's more to talk about there, but we'll move on. Yeah, that's really great. Thanks for sharing. I want to get your take on what I see as a disconnect or maybe a paradox in one corner of humanism. So to get at it, here's a quote from an essay on the website of the American Humanist Association that lays out the core principles of humanism. And it says, leaders of the religious right often say that humanism starts with the belief that there is no God, that evolution is the cornerstone of the humanist philosophy, that all humanists believe in situation ethics, euthanasia, and the right to suicide, and that the primary goal of humanism is the establishment of a one-world government. And indeed, what an agenda, right? Yeah. And when they get that done...
I'm really busy.
And he goes on, indeed, most humanists are non-theistic, have a non-absolutist approach to ethics, support death with dignity, and value global thinking, but such views aren't central to the philosophy. I really like that idea. I want to think that if someone ascribes to every principle of humanism except the idea that there is no God, that person might still be welcome in humanist circles, but then I see the logo of the American Humanist Association, and below the happy humanist, which I have on my stole this morning, is the quote, good without God. So it's not central, says one humanist, yet whoever developed that logo decided that that was the central point of view, or at least what they wanted to put out there. What's the role of theism or atheism in humanism?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I think there are many humanisms, and I think that the American Humanist Association is part of a secular atheistic humanism, and that came about during the rise of the moral majority and the religious right, when it became important as a social justice issue to reject that kind of oppressive religion. And during that time, the movement became very close with the atheist movement, so that there definitely is a large contingent of atheistic humanists who you probably would not want to hang out with if you had a God belief. But I think that what is most central to humanism is that for any good to happen, for good progress to happen in our world, human intervention is necessary. And I think that's at the core of all conceptions of humanism, is human responsibility and action. I think that it's a very activist life stance, that if you accept human responsibility, you have to be doing something. And so I feel that they're Christian humanists. As I said, I think Jesus was a humanist. I mean, these are people who are doing work and intervening to create good. And in my mind, the existence of God isn't central to whether or not we're going to behave in a way that changes our world for the better.
So that leads to the next question. What do you think humanists should be up to, particularly in this moment in the world right now? What does humanism have to say to us in the United States, just right after the G7 or 8 or 6, whatever it is, summit? It's been quite a week. I mean, the cake baker decision, and then in Arizona there was a more positive decision about these people who wouldn't sell invitations to gay. I mean, there's just a lot going on. What's humanism have to say to all that?
Well, there's so much in that question, but I think what's really cool about humanism is that it is essential that it be relevant. So we're always asking, what is it doing right now, and finding ways to apply it to our current situation. I think that one thing I want to emphasize, because the humanist community, and I think also the UU community, is more white, more educated, more wealthy than the general population in the United States, that we have a particular imperative right now, or a particular responsibility to work to shift power toward historically marginalized groups of people. I think that's in everything we do, we need to be figuring out how the system that we built collaboratively to benefit white landowning people, how that legacy is really terrible for black and brown people, and we have the power to change it, and we can't reform this without shifting that power and sharing that power, and in a lot of cases giving up that power. So I think that's a huge part of the call to the humanist community, and I think the UU community as well, that we need to have some humility and be handing over power and voice to historically marginalized people.
So I think, I can't remember, but I think we met at some sort of interfaith protest action or something
Sure.
like that. I think that's right. So how have you, I'm going to go off script, if that's okay.
Yeah.
How have you,
I didn't write it
you're right,
down.
yeah, you have no notes on this one. Yeah. How have you found the interfaith community as a humanist? I know you've been involved and you know a lot of faith leaders and work with a lot of faith leaders in the community. Have you found those relationships?
It's been really interesting. I mean, I think that the progressive interfaith community is eager to work with anybody who's going to do the work. But there's definitely been some skepticism about what humanists are about and where the seat of our values are, and are we going to be antagonistic to people of faith? I served for a couple of years on the Arizona Interfaith Movement board, and humanists and people of faith all thought that was weird. How is humanism a faith? But to me, again, the language isn't as important as the work. So that's been cool. And I think because I've been willing to do the work, and I think I've helped elevate the voices of some progressive faith leaders in the Phoenix area, that folks are ready to collaborate with me when I'm excited about a project. So.
Well, now I'm really curious. Could humanism be called a faith?
So I would call sort of the faith in humanity elements of humanism a faith. I mean, we don't have really strong evidence to suggest that human beings are likely to be more good than bad, or that our world is going to get better. I'm not even convinced that there's free will. So, but in order to have human responsibility mean anything, I kind of have to have some faith in that. I think there are definitely areas where we don't have facts. We have to just have heart and hope. And I'm not uncomfortable with faith language myself, but there are definitely the atheistic secular humanists would be cringing about that right now.
Can you, as we wrap up, can you talk a little bit about the work that you and Evan do? Just kind of, I know there's a lot of it, but
yeah, and so we've taken recently to calling ourselves entrepreneurial humanists, because we're kind of inventing and applied humanism as we go along, and looking for places where we think the world needs humanist projects, and where there's tribalism, where there's division, and we're trying to invent ways to fix that. So one of the things that we have started is a humanist podcast. We felt like there was a lack of storytelling and heart in humanist media and literature. A lot of it's heavily rational. And while that's really important, it's also important that we learn how to use our empathy and compassion effectively as a moral tool. So we started the Humanist Experience podcast, where we take on modern social issues and try and interact with them directly and tell stories about people having those experiences and what the humanist approach would be. We run a media firm called Spectrum Experience that's explicitly humanist. And we work with primarily political candidates who share our values, but also some nonprofits and other community organizations. So we try and get humanist voices into the media and shift the public discourse toward humanism. So those are the two big things that we're working on right now.
So I have a question for you all. How many of you would identify as humanists, have identified as humanists, or feel like you're probably a humanist? Yeah, a couple of you. 3, 4. Yeah. Well, I think humanism and Unitarian Universalism have a lot in common. We've, including people like Curtis Reese, who, a Unitarian minister in the 1930s, who was one of the sort of Humanist Manifesto guys. So, really glad that you dropped in. I know that Sunday morning is not worship time for humanists, and so we're really glad you're here. And will you be able to grab a snack and hang out for a few minutes after? Yeah, so if you want to say hi to Sarah after, she'll be around a little bit. Sarah, thank you so much.
Yeah, well,